This is, welcome everyone. This is our continuation of our 5th meeting of the Ad Hoc Group. And so the plan for today is to go through the items that we didn't get to at the last meeting. So specifically, we're going to talk about our screening criteria. We're going to talk piezometers and early implementations. And then the third presentation we have is on the forecast informed reservoir operations. And then also we want to talk about the winter operations that the department's going to use going into the next winter year. So after that, we reserved an hour. We reserved a whole big chunk of time there just for more open discussion. And so as we get into that, I'd like to talk a little bit, just to kick that off, about basically what the plan is for the remaining meetings of this process, and where the study will be, and then have a discussion about, from that, where should we focus in on what to talk about. So with that, since we're already running a little late, maybe let's just do a quick round of introductions here real quickly. I'll start with John Yarbrough, DWR.
Jim Nielsen. James Gallagher. Here.
Curtis Grima.
Ron Stark, present.
Genoa Widener.
Michael Bassett.
Matt Mintig.
Sean Early.
Rob Olmsted.
Ted Craddock.
Stephanie Campbell. Tara Alpha.
Ron Gervasi.
Lelia Mejia.
Betty Andrews.
Bruce Muller.
Paul Schweiger.
Linda Manning.
Les Harder.
Lizzie Williamson.
Sergio Esworth. Eric C.
John Lighthawk. Steve Irvin.
Rhonda Robbins.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. So with that, I'd like to let's just jump right into it.
Go for
and,
it.
Linda, I think you're up here with our first is the screening criteria.
All right, happy to kick it off. This is a very short presentation, but actually will actually serve as a nice little kickoff for us. Think of this as sort of the Google Maps moment to remind us where we are. We've seen this set of steps several times now. So if you'll remember, these are the 6 basic steps of a water resources planning study. Step number 1, identifying the objectives, constraints, needs, and opportunities. This represents about 30 to 35% of the work of the CNA, and it is now complete. Step 2, identify the measures to meet those needs. That in itself also represents, I would say, 30 to 35% of the work. We are wrapping this up in the month of October. Step 3, combining those measures to formulate plans. We're kicking that process off next week. Number 4, evaluate those alternative plans with agreed upon metrics, which we have shown you many times already. That's going to happen in the next month or so. Then we'll compare and rank those plans, and then we'll come up with a recommendation. Okay, so that's just to remind us where we are. Any questions about that slide?
Can we see I guess your latest copy of number 1 and 2, since you're saying you're pretty close to wrapping those up?
What do you mean by copy?
Or, I'm assuming you've wrapped that up. You've identified objectives, constraints, opportunities, and needs. Needs probably being something that's really maybe the most important.
So those have been covered in the presentations from the task teams in
Okay.
prior presentations. I'll also open it up to DWR if you want to respond further.
And then the measures to address those. Well, I've definitely seen a lot of process stuff.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I haven't really seen us say, yes, this is definitely the thing that is the problem, and here's the measure that we're going to address it with. I don't know that we've seen that.
So the 5th meeting there, we were really going through, here's the study that's being conducted right now. So leading up to that, it was a lot of process. The 5th one was, here's the details of the analysis being done. And so what our plan is it's at this upcoming meeting in November here is we're going to actually have then what the results of this condition assessment. So that's where we'll start talking about.
So that's
here's what we're seeing coming out of the
something
study.
that really summarizes what it is that we've seen. I know we've talked about a lot of different things. But we need like the bigger picture summary, I guess, is what I'm saying. So that'll be at the next meeting? Is that what you're saying?
I'd say at the next meeting, I'd also say at the, when we get to the hour here discussion, that's what I'd like to lay out is here's what's
Okay.
coming, and then we can talk about with what's coming, what should we focus on when we, for our future meetings there.
Okay,
So if I can push that off for,
perfect.
Yep, to be continued. All right. These are the same steps superimposed on our timeline, just to reiterate again. So that box number 1 up there, that's step 1, has been completed. Step 2, that's what we're going to finish up in the month of October. Those 2 boxes together represent 65, probably 70% of the work. And then we have the remaining 2 to come. Okay? So that's your Google map. We're going to zoom in to this box right here, box 2, and talk a little bit about how we came up with the measures, how we evaluated them, and how we screened them. Okay? So I'm trying to think back. I think in the last meeting, we covered the idea that a potential failure mode was a series of events, all of which have to happen in order to culminate in a consequence of a certain magnitude. So if we break down that potential failure mode into nodes or steps along the way, then that's what daylights for us the opportunity to address the issue at each node. So then we start developing our measures, and the first step is to brainstorm a whole universe of measures, as many as we can think of from any source that we can think of, including prior workshops, brainstorming among the teams, further research. We did a thorough job. We came up with a good set of initial conceptual measures.
Sure.
The measures went through 3 levels of screening and evaluation. So from that very large set of initial conceptual measures, we looked for obvious fatal flaws. We looked for measures that we really characterized as studies. We looked at things that are mostly monitoring or instrumentation, and we started to narrow down and pare down that set of measures. Then we took that second set of measures, the pared down set, and we started to qualitatively brainstorm, how is this going to help us reduce risk? Finally, we took what was remaining and we ran those measures against the potential failure modes through what we had developed called the condition assessment tool, and we quantitatively or semi-quantitatively assessed the kind of risk reduction that we could see. And those remaining measures are what we called feasible measures, and that's the set that's being promoted forward to the integration team for plan formulation. And we're having our workshop next week to kick off that process. So very quick, that's where we are. That's how we did it. Any questions?
Were most of these objectives that came out of the 2014 Part 12 versus how many of them came out of the 2019 Part 12?
Oh, gosh, I don't know, ratio of one to the other. What would you say, Les?
I think what you're referring to, is potential failure modes. That's generally what's identified in the Part 12 process. And so there was I'm going to say in round numbers, a few dozen potential failure modes considered in the 2014 Part 12 process, but not really permanent risk reduction measures. In this current round, both the level 2 semi-quantitative risk analysis and the comprehensive needs assessment have examined more than 200 potential failure modes, including every single one that was considered previously in 2014 and 2009. And then we've also developed potential measures, physical measures, that might be considered to reduce the risks. And we're evaluating those, like Rhonda said, in a 3-step process. Does that answer your question?
Well, I guess what how I should have worded it was, we pushed forward without the results of the, 171 probable failure modes from the level 2 and the current Part 12. to expedite the completion of the CNA, how much of those failure modes, although you have not received the recommendations from the consultants, which isn't due out until the end of this year, how much of that are we going to have to then reincorporate back in? Because as I look at the 6th task of the comprehensive needs assessment, most of it's stuff that was identified either in 2010 or 2014, recommendations following the Part 12s. And the instrumentation we're going to talk about was first brought up in 2010, and now we're getting around to doing it. If the recommendations that are due in the next couple of months out of this year's Part 12 weren't brought into this process, how far behind are they going to be before we can incorporate them in?
In the past, most of the risk reduction measures on the Part 12 process have involved things like improved observation, improved instrumentation, maybe update studies, like a new hydrology study or a new seismic study. They generally have not included major upgrades to the system. So what we're doing here is we're taking all those potential failure modes that were done in the past by the level 2 and ones we've also considered, looking at those that have the highest risks and identified, more than studies, more than instrumentation, but actual physical risk, physical features like a new spillway or a new tunnel or enlargement of the embankment. So these are major potential risk reduction measures that are generally over and above anything that's considered in the Part 12. Does that answer your question? And anyway, I think once we get the independent consultants report from the Part 12, we'll circle back with that to make sure that we haven't missed anything. But generally, I think the scope of what we're doing is much larger than that's typical for a Part 12 process.
Yeah, I think you're right, Les, and I'll just add to that. So the Part 12 process typically has a review, and there's a series of items that then we tackle kind of individually. This current process is really doing the full risk assessment of the facilities, so much more comprehensive than the typical Part 12 process.
Ron, question?
Yeah, a question or a comment. This discussion right here has talked about risk reduction measures, I think, in the context of dam safety issues. But at least it's my understanding that the CNA is a comprehensive needs assessment, and it goes beyond dam safety issues. For example, you're going to be making some recommendations on a new flood operations manual, or at least features. At least we presume you're going to do that. We also presume that you're looking at physical facility matching with the mission of the project. There are project missions, if only project missions embodied in the Reservoir Regulation Manual, that may not comport well with the actual physical structures you have up there. But they're not necessarily dam safety features. They're matching the mission with the project. So I don't expect an answer, but I do want to remind DWR and the IRB that presumably those kinds of studies or assessments are part of this comprehensive needs assessment.
Yeah, appreciate that comment, Ron. I think maybe the little bit of the distinction is this study's focused on dam safety on those 6 tracks we've talked about. But as we do this study, we're considering some of those other public resource areas. But this study really is focused on dam safety. You mentioned the reservoir operation manual update. So as part of this study, for physical features, say a spillway assessment, there's a reservoir operation component of that. But also we have the core manual update that is kind of broader than the dam safety focus of this study, although they're interconnected. So I think that there's just a little bit of a distinction that this is really focused on the dam safety aspect. recognizing that
Which
could
I'm
lead
gonna
to
push
other
back and just suggest
areas,
that
yeah.
it's disturbing, because I think that folks in the community in the Feather River Basin would not only like to have and be assured that the dam and its related structures are safe, but they'd also like to have the flood control features of the project competently constructed and, you know, match what the reservoir regulation manual or other kinds of flood control objectives the dam may have. So, you know, public safety is not just the dam breaking, but good operations when you're doing flood control operations.
Yeah, you're right on that. So, you know, it's dam safety, public safety. The reservoir operation component of it does have that connection to it.
Well,
But I think
thank
we're-
you for letting me push back.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, we're just recognizing that then that leads to a process with the Corps of Engineers on the water control manual update so there's just some interconnectivity from this process to that process.
Sure, but once again, DWR is not exactly a stranger to flood operations and flood control, and you certainly have the opportunity to make recommendations to the Corps about updating the manual, working with the Corps.
And I think we'll hear from John a little bit later on this topic, so that may be a good time to talk further on that.
Just for future, one thing I think I'd like to see, and I talked about this a little bit at last meeting, is I understand that you got a screening criteria, but like give us some examples of, like a real example. Hey, we looked at this, and after we went through our analysis, this is what and this is what went into deciding whether or not to adopt that measure or not, or to rule out that PFM or whatever it is, right? It would be good to see like what are some examples, and then ultimately like some kind of document that shows what your process was for all of those things,
And
right?
I think it'd be good if that information he's asking for is presented to the ad hoc group before November's meeting, so that we can come prepared for the meeting.
So I think, to both comments, I think that is very consistent with where we're going to be at when we get to November, because at that point, we're going to have some of these results that we're going to be ready to walk through. I'm not sure how much we're going to be able to present that beforehand, but by November, that's the type of material that we're looking to present there. So I think as we talk later about when we have that meeting next week, sort of what
Right.
is talking about different examples, or how, what kind of questions around when we say we're going to have some results to talk about, what should we be focusing on would be helpful to understand from the ad hoc group.
Yeah, it's just wanting to get some detail on that. I think a lot of the discussion from last time in here is like, here's what our process is, right? And even last time it was, hey, we've considered, I can't remember the number now, 170 PFMs, and cross-reference them with what the Part 12D group was doing too, right? I understand that was part of it. So we are working in conjunction with both of those processes and saying, hey, did you guys see something that we didn't see? It sounded like that's happening. But that's all like, hey, this is what we did, and here's those 170, but there's not really a lot of discussion about what are those 170 or what are those scenarios and what are you determining as a result, because that's where it hits the rubber meets the road for us, right, is, okay, well, what's been ruled out and what has been determined as maybe the best route to go, the best risk management approach to go. I think that's where, I think that's what you're getting a lot of this comments is more geared towards, well, what is it?
Yeah.
Right? Because that's what people are obviously most concerned about, right?
Well, we look at it as a forum, also an opportunity for us to give input.
Right.
And offer our thoughts, not a fait accompli, Here's the deal, bye. That's what this is, a participatory, work together process. Process is okay, but conclusions need input. And the earlier we can be able to offer that input, the better, that's all.
I would say to back up even further, I think when the senator and assemblyman first heard that there was going to be a comprehensive needs assessment to analyze everything and to potentially make some major changes in infrastructure and operations. You know, their first reaction was, we want the community to be involved so that we can say, yes, we agree with those major changes that are being made. We were looped in on the decision-making process, and we agree. And I think that's what the Assemblyman is getting to, is at the end of this, we're going to be kind of told, here's what we think needs to happen, and we need to be in a position where we agree, right, or disagree. And I get some of the process stuff is important to help educate us. We're not engineers, but ultimately, if the goal is for the community to be a part of it and agree with the outcomes, we have to see the specifics on what are the problems and what are the potential solutions. And so far, I feel like I haven't seen any of that. And I don't know if other people feel that way too. I feel like we've done a lot of process, but no actual information on what are the problems and what are the potential solutions.
So maybe I should pipe in and kind of interject, because we did, so Rune Sorensen's not here today, and myself, on behalf of Assemblyman Gallagher and Sarah Nielsen, met with John and Ted and Sergio about a week or so ago, and to Curtis's point there, really got down to kind of where we'd like to see these as we go into the second year and the final year of this, where we want to land on all this. And I think the conclusion and the agreement was, and I think that's what we'll be talking about in about, at the end of this, and I really want to save the time for that, and really leading into November, is this plan that the department will present kind of the issues that the identifiable structural or issues at the facility that you have identified that you believe need to be corrected or addressed, along with what measures or solutions you've identified up to this point, recognizing that the process is still going on, and offer both the identified problems, but also your identified solutions and corrective measures, and then allow us as a group to offer up our constructive criticism or suggestions or observations, or hey, have you missed something? And that's really where we would like to see these meetings go, proceeding into November, to your guys' point, so that we're not really focusing so much on the process, but rather where you guys are going, and allow us the opportunity to offer up our suggestions as a group, whether it's low-level outlet or some of the downstream impacts, allowed the group here to offer up. And I think that's where we are going, correct?
That's where we're going. That's where, as far as getting results, all of us are excited to see the output of these different assessments, and it just, it's been, I think July was our first meeting, but it just takes that long to do a big study like this. So, but that is where we're excited, where we have, we're November, we're expecting to have that discussion. And as Rob was saying, talking about, we'll have we'll have the assessment done, but that's where, what is helpful to hear from us is that, what are our areas of most concern as we present our, here's the risk we identified. We'd be interested, does that mesh what you guys expected, or does that seem different than what you would have thought? And what are the concerns that you would have brought in, and where do those fit into the study? So, I think we share the enthusiasm, and let's get to that point of the discussion. We're still almost there and should be there shortly.
Yeah, we're getting into the meat.
Yeah.
Right? And I think a lot of the discussion we've had in earlier meetings has been really good. But it has largely been around like, hey, for each of these tasks, here's the things that we're kind of looking at, and the IRB is saying, hey, having suggestions, you might want to analyze this piece as well as part of the discussion's been largely around, hey, what should we study, right?
Mm-hmm.
What should we be looking at, and what's the process? Well, now that we're starting to get into the meat, we want to see what the meat is, right, and give input on that, on that as well, right? So I think we know where we're at on that. So.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
shall we
let's
move
keep
on
on
to
task,
keep on
right.
trucking here? And so thank you. And our next stop is on the forecast informed reservoir operations, and then and not really a CNA topic, but since we have this group here, we wanted to talk about the winter operations and what we're doing with the reservoir coming into this next year. So,
Okay.
did I miss one?
You're doing
I missed
piezometers.
one.
Yeah, you missed one.
All right, I was seeing who was following along. So piezometers, Dr. Harder with piezometers.
I'm happy to be skipped.
Yeah,
That's what PowerPoints are for. They keep you on track.
that's right.
Thank you.
Old-fashioned.
Okay, I'm going to talk about an early implementation project involving the installation of new piezometers in Oroville Dam. So I think we told you before that during this 2-year process, we're identifying potential risk reduction measures that might be considered in a potential plan in the future. But if we saw something that is just a really good idea, a good thing to do, that should be done, we would identify that for early implementation and just do it. So there's a handful of those kinds of things that have been identified, and this is one of them. So the idea is that we're not going to wait till next year to conclude. We're going to go ahead and install some new piezometers in the dam. So the plan is, we already have a detailed plan for installing them. It's being reviewed by FERC and DSOD. Probably start implementing them, actually drilling holes in the next month or two. So this is a quick summary of what they are. Hopefully, we'll go through this very quickly, review past seepage control and monitoring systems in the dam, review what past seepage and drainage measurements have shown, and then talk about the 11 new piezometers. They'll be done in 2 phases, 6 of them at the downstream toe and 5 of them at the inside the core block and grout galleries. So this is the seepage control and monitoring system that was designed for the dam. So the impervious elements that makes it watertight is this large core of impervious material here that blocks the water from seeping through the dam. And in the rock foundation, a line of grouted holes to try and seal up fractures in the rock itself. And these bore holes, these grout holes that were originally drilled and completed in the 1960s go as deep as 200 feet. Any water getting past this is in part to be collected through drain holes in the gallery. So there's drain holes that go down 40 feet to collect any drainage and leakage through the rock here. Any water going through the core is picked up by the drain system and conveyed downstream. This is another impervious element, what we call this the seepage collection barrier, to try and block the seepage here, to collect it in an internal pool so it can be conveyed to a measuring weir and measured over time. So this is the control for seepage, the impervious elements, and then the drainage systems and the measuring points. So inside the dam through the rock in the galleries, most of you know that there's actually a gallery that goes down the slopes of both slopes of the abutments and down to the foundation. You can actually walk under the entire dam. Most dams you can't do that, but Oroville you can. And it's a gallery that's about 7 feet high. And this is where the grouting was done in the 1960s. Again, these grout holes are inclined upstream and go down as deep as 200 feet. And then we have these drainage holes to collect any drainage that seeps past them. And they are collected in the galleries as well. This is the little gutter that collects the drainage. And over time, the entire drainage from the rock under the center of the dam is generally about 80 gallons a minute, about 30 years ago. And so for those of you who don't know what a gallon per minute is, that's like a garden hose. So if you're watering your backyard with a garden hose, that's about a gallon a minute. So about 80 of those, that's the total seepage in the rock that's being collected over time. That has slowly declined, so it's now about 50 gallons a minute. Not a lot. To measure seepage through the dam itself, remember this is the core right here, the impervious element, and it was fitted with all these piezometers. These are piezometer locations, and also piezometers were put in upstream of the core and downstream of the core to measure the seepage levels that came through the core. Each of these piezometers is a Bureau Reclamation design from the 1950s. They call it a twin tube piezometer because each one has 2 tubes. This is one of those left over from Oroville. It has porous stones to let water into this little capsule. and then water comes out through these two tubes and runs back to the instrument house several hundred feet. Each of these has a gauge on it. So over time, we measured pressures on these instruments. I think most of you know that these are no longer functional because the tubes broke over time. But this is what they did show. So downstream of the core, we had created this pool blocked by this barrier, and the piezometers that were embedded below the level of the pool just measured the level of the pool. Those that were embedded above the pool were dry. So this confirmed the design intent. This is what was supposed to happen, and this is what they all measured. We had another set of instruments for measuring deformation, and you could measure water levels in their casings, and they confirmed the same levels. So close-up of that, these are instruments, these are readings in about the late 1990s. The instruments that were embedded in the pool just registered the pool level. The instruments in the core and upstream, we had higher levels. This is an instrument in the foundation, P1, that is below the core block in the core, and it measured seepage going through the rock, and it was a higher level. So over time, the one in the rock is very responsive to the reservoir. As the reservoir went up and down, so did it. But it declined with time, similar with the drainage in the rock. So over time, the seepage to the rock could be seen as being reduced. The levels in the pool, the piezometers in the pool just registered the pool level because that's an internal dam. So again, this was blocked off here so that we could collect the water and measure it. If this barrier had not been put here, it would just have run out in the river and be hidden from view. So looking down on the dam, so here's the outline of the dam, here's the crest. This outline is the footprint of the core. And here's the pool. The pool is only in the very bottom of the river channel. And it's a three-dimensional seepage collection system, so any water going through the core or through the rock and it comes down the slopes and is collected in this pool. And in plan view, this barrier here looks like this. It's as much as 80 feet high. Everything at Oroville is big. And it's about 200 feet long. This is the edge of the pool. And over here, there is a pipe in the rock that it's about a 30-inch pipe, and it goes about 250 feet to this instrument vault where these weirs here measure seepage over time. So not much seepage comes out. So during the dry season, this is a plot of the reservoir level. So this is reservoir at elevation 700, all the way up almost a full reservoir at the 900 over the between October 2015 and October 2016. This is the level of the seepage measured at the weirs here, at these weirs. And during the dry season in October all the way to December, it's registering less than 10 gallons a minute, less than 10 garden hoses. But when it starts raining, it picks up because what happens is rain infiltrates into the downstream shell of the embankment. And what we're measuring most of the time during the wet season is just rainfall. So even, we pick up some rain. These are levels of weekly rain intervals. So when it starts raining, we pick up. And when it stops raining, it declines. When it starts raining again, it picks up. And when it stops rains, it declines. So even though the reservoir is rising, the seepage is going down because it's really dependent mostly on rainfall. And it's been doing that every year. So every year, whenever it rains, the seepage pool comes up and seepage comes out, and then when it stops raining, it declines, and it does that every single year. So what are we doing with our new instruments? We're going to put them in two phases, 6 of them here at the toe, and 5 of them here internally in the galleries. What's the purpose of them? The purpose of the phase 1, the 6 instruments at the toe, is to improve our understanding of the 3D seepage effects at the barrier. How much of that seepage is trapped by the barrier, how much of it goes past or around the barrier or underneath it. And so we want to better understand the 3D flows. We've got some 3D, we recently did some 3D seepage models that we've never done before, and they indicated some potential loss of some of that seepage around the barrier, and we want to confirm that. So we basically want to find out what portions of the seepage we might be missing. The phase 2, the 5 piezometers in the core block and the grout galleries, 1 piezometer is going to be drilled from the gallery downstream into the seepage pool to try and get an upstream measurement of that water level. The rest of them, 4 of them, are going to be in the bedrock to confirm past measurements of seepage and pressure, and to monitor the continuing decline of seepage through the rock over time. So this is a view of at the downstream toe. We're looking down here. We're going to be drilling vertical holes from access roads. So right here, we're putting 1 instrument into the Zone 5A blanket drain, another one into rock. And over here, we're going from a different road. We're going to do it in the downstream Zone 3, downstream of this, of the barrier, and then another one downstream of the rock. And each of these will be vertical holes. Like this one is a vertical drill hole. We'll put a sensing zone of pervious sand and slotted pipe to let water come in here. We'll seal up the rest of it, and we'll be able to measure the water level in this pipe. We are also going to install vibrating wire piezometers, basically a transducer to get continuous measurements. So we'll be able to measure it not just once a week, but continuously, and also remotely be able to have it tied into a remotely accessed system. So each of these new piezometers are going to have an electronic data acquisition system. When it's completed, what you'll see at the ground is this pipe sticking out. There'll probably be a collar pipe to protect it, like this one is. This is one we recently installed on the emergency spillway. And in plan view, how these 6 are arranged is 2 of them are up here, upstream of the barrier, 2 of them are downstream. There's also going to be 1 left and right of the barrier to try and get 3D seepage effects. So these 2 are those 2. Those 2 are those 2 downstream of the barrier. This is an outline of the barrier, and then again left and right. Now I have been talking about putting 6 here.
Les, I'm trying to just get my bearings.
Sure.
Where is that seepage collection barrier? Like, what am I looking at there in terms of where the dam is?
Okay.
And where, you know what I mean?
So the barrier is right here at the downstream toe.
Okay.
All right. So that barrier,
And it goes all the way across the bottom there?
it goes all the way across the bottom, but at that point, the
It's
bottom
only-
is only 250 feet wide.
Right, okay.
Right? So that barrier is this barrier.
Right,
This is about as high as 80 feet,
right.
all right? And so that barrier is this highlighted area here.
Okay,
So because it's in the river channel, and then as you go up this way, the ground gets higher, and therefore the ground is higher than the barrier is.
right.
So the barrier doesn't go any further.
And
So this is about,
That's a view looking like you were from down on it, right?
yep, this is a bird's eye plan view looking down. So here's the road, here's an access road, the power plant's right here, the access to the power plant. If you've been there and driven down the tunnel to the power plant, that area is here, the area control center is here. This is the river channel, which is filled with water, which is the diversion pool. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, and then where the water comes out of that little pipe,
Yeah.
that's further down.
Where it comes out of the weirs, here, that pipe is this pipe, and where you measure it is right here.
Right, that's,
So you
Okay.
take a little road down here to get to that.
right, okay.
So what I was going to try and say is that I've been talking so far about doing 6 piezometers here, these 2, those 2, this one and this one. As a result of the last meeting with the IRB, there was a recommendation to add 2 more. And basically, it would be redundant of these 2 to provide redundancy and verification of whatever we get here. So we've accepted that recommendation from the IRB. We've amended our plan to FERC for that. So we're now going to put 8 here rather than just 6. All right, phase 2 will be drilled not from the outside, but from the gallery tunnels. So there's going to be 5 of them. These 3 are in the core block, which is the footing for the core at the bottom of the river channel. And it's got galleries here that you can walk into. And from this gallery here, we would drill a hole horizontally 40 feet, and we'd be able to tap into the fill, the zone 3 fill here. And that's at the upstream end of that seepage barrier. So we'll get a measurement of the water level in that pool at its upstream end. The other ones at the toe will measure the pool at the downstream end. So remember, the pool is here, and these piezometers will measure the water level in the pool here, and this one will tap into the pool right here. So we'll get an upstream measurement and a downstream measurement. This one will be drilled vertically down about 80 feet for an instrument in the rock. This actually will be a replacement of that P1 piezometer I talked about that reacted really well. And this actually is very close to where that one used to be. And so this is a replacement. This is a new one. We never had any piezometers here before. We're going to put one here to try and understand how the seepage changes and the pressures change as it moves from upstream to downstream. So these 3 are in the core block, which is at the maximum section of the dam, where the dam is at its highest. Those 3 will be down here, and we're also going to put 1 each at the mid-height to see if the seepage in the rock changes any at those levels. We've never had any instruments there before, but we thought we'd try and measure those, in part because of the different 3D nature, but also because the rock quality is different. The rock is more heavily weathered higher up on the abutments than it is in the bottom of the river channel. This is a listing of our 11 piezometers. Now we're going to be going to 13, but basically it lists the kinds of depths we're talking about, anywhere from 50 feet to almost 180 feet. And so phase 1 is probably going to start in a month or 2 and probably take a month or 2 to get all those 8 holes drilled and the piezometers installed. Phase 2 will probably be done next spring within the core block. It'll be a lot trickier because you have to haul all your equipment in and drill in confined space. And there'll be a lot more safety issues involved in the galleries than out at the toe. But we've drilled there before, so we expect to be able to do it again. Any questions?
Originally, there was 50-some instruments.
The original, yeah, there were 57.
And what was the reason for that many? What was the thought behind installing that many?
To be honest with you, the majority of those instruments are in the core. And part of it was to try and understand how pore pressures are generated in a sloping thin core during construction. So construction pore pressures. They were intended mainly to measure construction pore pressures. So remember, at the time this was being done, Oroville was the highest dam ever built in the world. And so trying to understand how those pore pressures developed during construction was something considerably worthwhile. All the instruments that were installed upstream of the core, and there was about a dozen of those, simply monitored the reservoir level. So if you read the gauge, it would tell you what the reservoir level was. Well, we have better ways of monitoring the reservoir. Mm-hmm. Most of the ones downstream, as I said before, were dry because so little seepage comes through, it just goes down to that seepage barrier and stays there. So most of them were dry. So of all the instruments we put in, it was good to confirm things. but most of them didn't tell us much after the dam was completed.
Seems the objective behind this effort is mostly on missing seepage in the collecting system and finding out if there's internal seepages going on, but is not those instruments also an early indication of seepage, like at the green spot or weak spots in the dam? We know we're built on a fault, and we know after extensive studies that your seismologies have been questioned, you're going back and redoing it again. We had, 2,000 minor earth movements below the dam during the 17 release. And do not more instrumentation give you more early warning if after an earthquake event that there's been some movement, that there's been some seepage? We were told a couple meetings back that we don't have the ability to dewater the dam fast enough according to regulations, that in the case of an event and we have seepage going on, that without an additional low-level outlet, we can't dewater the reservoir according to FERC standards and expectations, right? So the faster we learn of seepage, maybe the faster we could start the process of dewatering. And I don't know if what we're doing here, trying to find out the accuracy of the collection system, is going to give us the early warning that we need of seepage caused after an earthquake event. It could, maybe somebody from the IRB elaborate on that concern for me?
Well, I can try first, and then I'd invite the IRB to extend or correct me where I'm off track. You raised a lot of issues there, and so I'm going to try and take them one at a time. The best way to observe the health of a dam is the seepage. You touched on that, but then you mentioned piezometers. So measuring seepage, so there could be, in theory, weak points anywhere on this dam. This dam is a mile wide at the top. And so the idea that you're going to put a piezometer in just at the exact weak point that there might be is unlikely. So rather than do that, you try and collect, or the general approach, if you could do it, is to monitor the overall seepage. That's how you best monitor the health. We are trying to better understand the three-dimensional aspects of the seepage here and make sure that we are monitoring correctly the seepage. We think we have over time. We think we've monitored it well. We put in, the department put in a major investment for that seepage collection system in the first place. Not every dam has that. A lot of dams don't have anything close to that. So there was a major investment made. We think we understand what's going on, but we want to make sure. That's why the focus has been on the seepage barrier to make sure it is collecting everything we think should be going on. Putting piezometers in the cores of dams is now recognized as a bad idea generally, because you're poking a hole in a perfectly good core, and you're more likely to do damage than you are to learn anything about it. What we think better is to try and understand the seepage level downstream of the core, which is the focus of what this initiative is. And so that's what we're trying to do here. You mentioned about faults and so on. There's no known fault through the dam itself. The major fault here in this area is Cleveland Hill Fault. It daylights in the reservoir, but does pass underneath the dam, but it passes at depth, several kilometers below the dam, because it's a dipping fault. Mm-hmm. But there's no known fault that actually is in the footprint of the dam itself. It daylights east of the dam in the reservoir. With regard to being able to draw down the reservoir, there's two criteria by the Division of Safety Dams to try and meet emergency drawdown requirements. The first one is to draw down 10% of the reservoir height within 7 days. The second one is to be able to totally evacuate the reservoir within 90 to 180 days, depending on whether it's a power plant or not. The first one is the more important one, is to rapidly be able to take the water off the top of the dam. And we actually meet that easily. We with the FCO gates, we can do the upper 10% in 2 or 3 days. So we actually meet that criteria quite well. The other one is we can, you're quite right, we can't currently draw down the reservoir more than about half the height. We can follow the general rate or approach the general rate that Safety Dams wants, but once we get the reservoir down to the level of the intake for the power plant, we can't really dewater it past that. So you're right, we can't dewater the lower half.
Let's try to keep it on our,
But in terms of volume, we can, of the reservoir, we can dewater the, say, 2/3 of the reservoir.
Les, I was thinking maybe I'd jump in here, because some of these are topics, I think as we, I guess at the next meeting, as we get into, here's some of the biggest risks we see, some of this idea of drawdown capacity, I think, would be captured in that discussion. So, and we are starting to get behind here, so my proposal would be, Matt, if it's all right with you, if we, some of these questions here, those would be, I think would be appropriate as we talk about, next meeting, we're gonna talk about vulnerabilities. These, I think questions are, are these issues you're raising, are those drivers and what we're seeing? I think that'd be a good discussion we have at the next meeting there.
Okay.
So I don't wanna cut you off, but I wanna make sure we don't get too far behind, if that's all right.
Okay.
Just
Yep.
really quickly, Les, on another reason that we're doing this, right, is in response to FERC Part 12D's last, they've identified several times, like with regard to the green spot, as, hey, you guys might want to do some more monitoring just to understand what might be going on here. Not that we think it's a seepage through the dam, but there is this wet spot that we're seeing there. Having better instrumentalities there to measure. Is that also part of, I think you mentioned like this is also in response to FERC's Part 12D management plan that they want us to do, right?
Right. Prior to the 2017 incident, the last Part 12, 5 years ago, was 2014. There was a couple of recommendations that had several parts to them to better document the construction conditions and the seepage conditions in the dam, and, I don't have the exact words, and to consider adding a piezometer. You've got it highlighted? All right. Thank you. So, yeah, a lot of these sub things, but I don't remember exactly where it is, but they did ask for, to consider adding additional piezometers. And so we have made that consideration, and this is the result of that in part. So it also addresses some of that as well. So you're quite right on that.
And just to be clear, they also recommended that in 2009, right?
I think they recommended consideration, not to actually do it, but that the department should consider it.
Installing new piezometers.
That the plan and schedule should be completed by January of 2013.
I don't have that in front of me. Is that the 2009? Right, and so the department did prepare a study to address this, and they did produce a report. So what we've done now, and I wasn't part of that, so I don't have that handy, but the department did produce a study in response to that recommendation before that deadline. Since then, following the 2014 Part 12, the 2014 Part 12 independent consultant recommended a whole series of studies, and you showed me them just a minute ago, and we are in the process of wrapping those up. One of those, again, was to consider additional instrumentation, and again, this addresses that.
The timely completion of these recommendations going back to 2010 and 2014 is something we hope to discuss further in a future meeting.
Thank you, Les.
Thanks.
Sure. Who can I give this to?
Mr. Lehigh, and I already did my introduction for John's talk, so I won't redo it. I'll let him jump right into it.
Can I borrow your pointer? No, actually, I'll go old school with a laser pointer. Go on? Okay. All right, then am I good? Okay. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. Again, John Lehi with State Water Project Water Operations. So I'm here to give update on a couple of water operations related items. As in the last segment, Les was talking about the gasometers, which represented a little bit of a proactive measures that are taking place, and I think that the couple of operations updates that I have here represent that as well. So I'm going to talk about first the plan for flood operations here in this coming winter, 1920, and then also the forecast informed reservoir operations initiative, in which the department is engaged with a number of agencies. So to start with, I thought it'd be good to take a look at where the reservoir has been operated over this past year. So what's shown here is in the solid blue is the actual storage levels for the reservoir starting in October, the beginning of the water year of 2019. What's shown in the red line here that varies between the upper black dashed line and the lower dashed black line is the flood control rules per the Army Corps of Engineers. It actually includes enhanced flood pool that we operated to this last year. And as a Section 7 dam, the department has a responsibility to follow the Corps' flood control rules here. So you can see that we did have some engagement with the flood control diagram in late spring. And by design, there is some encroachment into that flood pool, at which point the flood control rules dictate the releases based on forecasted or actual observed inflows, plus the amount of encroachment that occurs during that time. This is also the period where we first engaged the spillway. So here is the Corps' flood control space. You can see that it varies starting early October through into June, and the amount of encroachment, or the amount of flood control space that's required varies depending on the wetness of the watershed. And so that's the reason you were seeing a variation on that red line, which is the flood pool. So this upper line here represents a dry basin. This is the required flood control space, so it's 375,000 acre feet of space. If it's a very wet winter, we're required to keep additional flood space, so that's up to the 750,000 acre feet, or elevation just over elevation 848. And this is the release schedule as required in the flood control manual. And the release requirements over here, I apologize for the fuzziness of this slide, but it's based on a combination of the actual or forecasted inflows into the reservoir, plus the amount of encroachment into that flood space. And that dictates the releases downstream. And so the dam and the outlet capacities of the dam, in coordination with those flood control rules, is designed to manage what's called the standard project flood, which we introduced in one of the past meetings, without exceeding the downstream channel capacities in the Feather River. And I'll have a graphic for that here shortly. To put the standard project flood in context, it shown here peaking close to 450,000 CFS peak inflow. For context, showing here the largest inflow event on record since the dams have been built, which was the 1997 event, which peaked just over 300,000 CFS. Also shown in blue here is the February 2017 event, which peaked just under 200,000 CFS. So the standard project flood is the design flood for flood operations for the dam. In addition to managing, as I said, the kind of the upstream and utilization of that flood control space. We're also looking at coordinated operations with New Bullards Bar on the Yuba River. And so we have a number of downstream flow requirements, one at Yuba City, Marysville, and at Nicholas at the confluence with the Sacramento River. And so both flood control diagrams for both New Bullards Bar and Lake Oroville have these common control points downstream of Yuba City. And so this is the more important criteria. If there's a conflict between the two, the downstream would govern.
That's max CFS?
That's max CFS, that's right. So one of the issues we have is that the original flood control diagrams assumed the construction of Marysville Dam, which would have added a significant amount of flood control space for the system as a whole. That was never built. So what that has caused is, in order to manage this standard project flood at Lake Oroville, rather than contain that below the emergency spillway, it did require some surcharge above the emergency spillway in order to manage that standard project flood in coordination with New Bullards Bar and to not exceed these downstream capacities. So one of the, so what we did back this past winter during construction, we're still in construction of the emergency spillway, we wanted to be able to contain that standard project flood without the surcharge occurring, knowing that Marysville Dam was never constructed, is not downstream. So what we did was we asked HDR to design a enhanced flood pool that would allow us to contain that standard project flood, not exceed the downstream capacities with a coordinated operations with New Bullards, and not rely on any surcharge whatsoever at the emergency spillway. So that's the plan that was put in place for this last year. It is our plan to continue to operate to that this coming year. So that would include an additional 170,000 acre-feet of flood space under a wet condition. It's additional 13 feet and additional 30 to 40,000 under the dry scenario. Now we do transition back to the original 1970 flood control diagram as we get into the spring in an effort not to impact water supply, recreational type activities as we get later into the spring. So our plan is to continue with the same plan for this coming winter. We want to see what the kind of the results are to the CNA report, the risk assessments there. So since that is not complete, we're going to continue to operate to this enhanced flood pool for this coming winter. Okay, so the second topic I wanted to cover is the Yuba Feather Forecast Informed Reservoir Operations Initiative. So we did kick off this effort. So this is a joint effort primarily with Yuba Water Agency, DWR, and the Corps of Engineers and others. We did formally kick off that process this past summer. This is the third official, by official I mean sanctioned by the Corps, ongoing FERC program. So the first was at Lake Mendocino in Sonoma County, and the second is Prado Dam in down south in Orange County. So this one would represent the third, and it is much more complex, involving two reservoirs rather than just one. Each one of these programs is very unique. Prado Dam is largely a dry dam, flood control only, and so each of these programs or these projects represents a very unique set of circumstances. This program is going to build upon what we've had in place for the last 10 years or so, which is the Forecast Coordinated Operations Initiative, which has been After the 97 event, Yuba, at that time, Yuba County Water Agency and DWR partnered with this FCO project. We can build on that foundation for the FERO program moving forward. There's really two main components the way I look at it to the FERO, to the Yuba Feather FERO. One is to initiate research into improving those precipitation and runoff forecasts. That one's pretty much a no-brainer. So we want to have better information. The better information we have, the better decisions that could be made as far as operating the reservoirs. The second part of that is to conduct some viability assessments. Is this improved forecast capability, is it a good fit for the capabilities of the dam and the outflow capabilities of the dam? Can we actually utilize that, operationalize those improved forecasts or the skill level that exists in the forecast in order to make improvements in the operations? So that's a second component. And we also think that this is going to be a very important piece in informing the development of the water control manual update. So a degree of forecast-based operations was incorporated into the Folsom, the recent Folsom water control manual update, for example, and we want to see if it's a good fit for Oroville as well. So this is just to give you an idea who's on the committee. So I'm a chair along with Kurt Akins from Yuba Water Agency, Dr. Marty Ralph from Scripps Institute with the Western Weather Extreme Center. Here's the other members. We have the state climatologist. We've got two sides of the Corps. We have the research part of the Corps. We have the water operations side of the Corps. We have NOAA in terms of the National Weather Service. We have, to keep the fishery stakeholders engaged, we've got a NIMS representative. We also have, of course, the operators for both DWR and Yuba Water Agency. And also we have a member from the Mendocino FERO Steering Committee to help us with lessons learned, perhaps in their activity there at Lake Mendocino. So this is a little schematic showing the existing process, which has been this forecast coordinated operations, which I described a little bit earlier, which included better coordination between Yuba Water Agency and DWR, State Water Project operations, in managing through floods. We've built a common operating model for the two reservoir operators so that we can communicate directly on what those downstream flows are going to look like. We have annual training exercises that occur. Again, improved communications. And we have included some monitoring enhancements in terms of gauging, stream gauges, snow pillows in the basins. So that's what has occurred last 10 years. We're taking some elements of that in the yellow here, and we're looking to apply some additional improvements as part of the FERO. So that would include more refined reservoir models for the watersheds themselves, risk-based water management approach, and additional research on improving forecasting generally, and some recommendations on an additional monitoring. And we're actually putting in some additional monitoring already. So these are the intended outcomes. Again, improved research on better predicting the atmospheric rivers, potential for this to roll into a new water control manual as a more explicit part of those operating rules. So here's some of the more immediate research investments that are occurring. We've got the Air Force WC-130J hurricane hunters that fly during the hurricane season on the East Coast. What's The good news there is that the hurricane season does not align with the atmospheric river risk season. So we take these same the same flights, move these guys to the West Coast, and they're already funded to make half a dozen to a dozen flights out to the atmospheric rivers that we're expecting this coming winter to help improve the observations there. We also have, there's additional Pacific buoy observations going in place. On the land-based monitoring, we have new atmospheric observations via weather balloons. These are put up every few minutes or so during atmospheric river. Snow level vertical pointing radar, that's a huge need there for investment in terms of getting to dial in what the freezing zone is in the atmosphere, because that's one of the big uncertainties in terms of whether precip event is going to fall mainly as rain or mainly as snow. Surface meteorological stations throughout the Feather and Yuba basins, including soil moisture instrumentation. So these are some of the things that are going in this coming winter. This is the tentative schedule for the FERO process for the Yuba Feather FERO. Up front, it's engaging in a lot of these investments to collect data for those research efforts, putting together the work plans. You can see it's an extended process, but we are taking proactive measures now, as I've just indicated. And eventually, we see this as a big piece to help inform an update to the Water Control Manual. So again, the next steps would include, an interim flood control operations plans, which includes the one we're looking at with the enhanced flood pool for this coming winter. Completion of the CNA process will help inform what might eventually go into a Water Control Manual update. And we think forecast-informed reservoir operations is an important piece of that as well. So forecast-informed reservoir operations, we see potentially goes into this manual update, but it could be a standalone process as well. One thing we might explore is a number of pilot years between now and the eventual completion of that Water Control Manual to help us test out some of these, the feasibility of forecast coordinated operations. So that's all I had. Oh, yeah, that's all I had. Not my slide. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, something.
So this is all really good. I mean, one of the things that I highlighted, in the aftermath of the Oroville evacuation was coordinated ops worked out really well in terms of managing that water, kind of in the aftermath and making sure that we, to me, it was one of the things that worked really well in that event, as we still, a lot of people don't remember, we still were worried about levees downstream, and water had been up against those levees for a longer period of time than normal. And so I know the coordinated ops with Bullard's Bar and making sure, hey, what are these flows going to look like, I think was good. And so building upon that, I think is really a really positive thing. And I think the other good thing about this is for the public to know is that once again, we are keeping the lake lower during those most, concerning months of the year. We're keeping the lake lower, significantly lower than we otherwise would. I think your first graph, really showed that. So, that's a good thing. And then obviously this will help inform what will ultimately hopefully be a better manual, right? In terms of how we manage that water, especially during flood season. I think the one thing that I just, I'll repeat this, I've said it to others before, but I'll repeat it again, is we are going to have some good data that's being collected, right, and that helps inform that decision. We need to really have a good way, DWR needs to have a good way of communicating that information to the public. Because what happened this last season was, I think people knew that we kept it lower, but it was during that spring months when it started going back up. And there were people that had questions like, well, why are you letting it go back up to this level? Isn't there still snowpack up there? This is, you know, and there was a vacuum there created that you guys didn't really fill. And so I'd say, look, that's where if we have this data that says, hey, here's why we're doing this, because actually we have readings that show actually there's not very much in terms of snowpack and that could come in at any one time. You know, communicating that data to the public as to, hey, here's why we're doing that in a simple, synthesized way, I think is key just for this upcoming season, really thinking about that. I've had conversations with Carla about it, and with Ted, but I think, you know, making sure that we're ready to communicate when people are seeing those changes in elevation, here's why we're doing that, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Appreciate that. Ron?
I have what I hope is a quick question. Thanks again for excellent presentation. You do good. I did notice that the IRB had a recommendation, which is somewhat unusual, but didn't scare me that they made it. Probably didn't scare you either, but you know, you think that under your existing manual, you know, you can't go more than 150 unless you're, you know, in the emergency spillway release diagram world as a release from the dam, and you shouldn't get more than 300K at the confluence with the Yuba and some of these other control points. But in the context of coordinated operations with New Bullard's Bar in particular, and potentially something on the Bear that's much smaller, but the IRB was recommending that you explore a recommendation, well, a manual that would allow you under specified circumstances to have an objective release in those circumstances of greater than 150K out at Oroville. Is that, now this comes to specifics, is this something you're thinking of in particular since the IRB suggested you should think about it?
Yes, I mean, actually, that sort of idea has actually come up in discussions already in this forecast informed operations group. It's, you know, something we haven't delved into very deeply. It would be something, you know, quite complicated. We need to, you know, deliberate on it very carefully. But yeah, it is something that has come up, and like I said, the Corps is very much engaged in this, and so, you know, so I think there's a lot of potential if it looks to be something that's feasible, makes sense. I think that, you know, the Corps in this process, and it's something they potentially could adopt if it makes sense.
Just a comment. I think this is great information also. And I wanted to piggyback a little bit off what James said. As a downstream stakeholder, what I'm really concerned about is how those releases are managed, you know, in a slow and methodical manner. And I don't see that in here. I'm sure it's in there somewhere. But that's where the damages occurred for the levee system when it was rapid increases to the river, the flows, and then a rapid decrease. And that's where we got, you know, we sustained a lot of our damage. So is that element in there in this process somewhere?
Yeah, so there is a ramping criteria already that's in the Corps manual. I didn't have it shown, but there is a, for both increasing and decreasing, there's ramping rates that we need to adhere to as part of that.
So those aren't going to change?
At this point, there's, yeah, there hasn't been a discussion about that.
Okay.
Yeah. And then, of course, we also have ramping criteria as it relates to the fishery, but that's at lower flow levels, not the high flood flows.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, John.
Not now, but maybe next meeting, you're talking about doing the manual 2022 to 2024. Is that going to be the only opportunity for public input?
So Yeah, we can, like you said, we can talk about it another time.
Yeah.
This is sort of a placeholder on there. It's going to be a course process, so we can't really dictate the timeline on that.
So
But that's,
maybe we can talk more next meeting as you do some more research on where different stakeholders downstream can add early input. Because this is a sizable project
yep.
of this kind. Thank you.
And also, just on that topic, the other venue we have now is the Citizens Advisory Commission for Oroville.
Yeah.
November 20th, we have our next meeting. And so this topic around flood operations and this sort of topic, we're expecting to get more into at that meeting there. So some of these where there is a lot of interest on the water control manual, as we're trying to wrap up this study, there might be, this might not be the best spot to talk about that. It might be this other group here that might be a better forum to talk more about where do we go with water control manual
We're
update.
getting a broader component of people that are interested. That's one of the key elements is to get what goes on here out to the world, the average citizen. And a number of things that there's still much concern about the green spots, and that has not dissipated or diminished. So that other forum, though, is also helpful. But I would observe not contradictory, but complementary to what we're doing here.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think that we are looking more like at the assets here in this discussion, and hey, what might need to be done to improve, upgrade, add on, right? But the flood control and we've talked about this a lot. Flood control manual is not necessarily part of that, but I think everybody agrees it probably needs to happen, and so it seems like things are already kind of moving in that direction. So, and I think it can very much be part of the discussion we have at the commission level. And how, again, I think it's always going to be about how does that go about, right? What does that involve and how much does that entail? I think we're really concerned about the flood portion of it mostly, right? Those flood years when we have a big snowpack and the potential for an atmospheric river, I think everybody agrees we can manage the reservoir better in those circumstances. And, that's what I'm kind of hoping results of that.
Well, this takes us to the end of the presentation portion. So now we have time. We left time here at the end here to have more of an open discussion. I did want to start this by talking about just where we see the next meeting. So really we see there being really 3 meetings here after this one. And so the next meeting coming up in November is where, as we talked about earlier, this is where we're really going to be able to talk about some of the results. This is where the process is leading us here. So these are the things we'll be ready to talk about. I want to hear then where we should focus on within each of these areas. So this next meeting, we are going to be able to talk about results, and we'll be able to start talking about here's the different measures. So here's the different projects that would fix problems, right? So when I say we talk about results, it's of the condition assessments. So these are identifying vulnerabilities, things we're concerned about, and measures. So what are some things we could do to address those? That's the next meeting. The second meeting, the meeting after that, which will be, I think, is looking at spring sometime next year, we'll be able to finish talking about, we'll have completed looking at identifying all the different measures, all the different things we could do to fix problems. And we'll be able to start talking about here's how we would group some of these measures together in the plans. Because if you have one project, it might solve a collection of projects. So how do you come up with a collection of these different measure solutions into a plan? So that's that meeting. And then the third meeting will basically be at a spot where we're ready to conclude our discussion of what these plans look like and then talk about, how do we communicate this out? What's the report? Where do we go from there? So that's sort of the arc we see, at least where the study's progressing here. But so with that, then wanted to have more of the discussion around, so what kind of input, what kind of questions would you have about each of those topics that then we could focus as we're preparing material on. as Rob mentioned, we had a good discussion with Rob, and Rune met with Ted and Sergio and I and Linda about, how could we better communicate with the group here? And so one of the things that I took away from that discussion is maybe we should have briefer, maybe a little higher level presentations, less presentations, and then with more time for discussion, which I think might be appreciated by the group, but at the same time, our struggle's always been there's just so much material that we could talk about. So as we're, where do we focus our time together in our discussion? The other change we'd see is, as we started, we were really trying to just mirror what we were presenting topic for topic with the IRB. And so our thought is, instead of really trying to, having that as an objective, let's just have this discussion on where the interest is, let that guide which topics we focus on, and meaning that there might be some topic we present to the IRB, they'll providing comments on it, and so we expect you to be aware of it that way, but we wouldn't necessarily give you a presentation on it. So.
And I think, to elaborate on that, I think where we really nailed down is what this group really wants to talk about is what are the identified issues that have been, found in the CNA as relates to the operations and the maintenance and ongoing structures up on the facility. We want to know what you guys have seen, what you've identified through this process, and then also what measures or solutions you've identified up to this point, recognizing that there may be additional changes that, and then allow everyone in this group time to offer their constructive, observations or critiques or opinions on that, and really keep it more high level so that folks can focus on the issues that they identify as being the ones that they have input on, and rather than having presentations that really talk about how you identified that problem, allow us more of an opportunity to talk about where we think maybe you missed something, or where you were spot on, or where have you thought about how this might impact downstream, or whatever it may be, and keep it more on that trajectory. So what I think the department was going to do by the November meeting was really, hopefully in advance, but get us as a group the identified issues or measure or problems. I don't know what the right term would be. The issues that you've identified at the facility up to this point in the CNA, as well as what kind of solutions or measures you've identified that you're looking at as possible corrective actions, and allow us then to digest that and come to the November meeting and talk about those.
That's right, and I'm not sure if we're going to be in a good spot to give that to, really present that ahead of time, but I think we could say that, that's, we want to talk about the results here, and so how do we do that? And so, we could, is it more interest for us to focus on, here's our list of the top 4? Is it their interest in, here's all the things we considered that we ruled out, like these are some of the different types of things.
I'll defer to them and them on that.
I'd be interested to know, in November when we show you, here's what rose to the top for us, just as the downstream community, how does that mesh with what your expectation was and what the results would be? And I think it'd be interesting where you were expecting things that we're not showing. I'd expect that you'd probably want to know what's the story with that one? Where did that end up on the list?
Is there a way, from someone who's watched all the videos and kind of is just coming into this, the packets that are sent out beforehand are great, a lot of information, but then it's gone over in minute detail and takes up all the time of the meeting, rather than giving us a packet of information that we digest and then can come and say, wait, I have a question about this specific thing, and have a discussion more that way than the presentations. So if you did give us all of the, problems that have been identified, each of us would have a time to look that over and then identify the ones we want to go more in depth with, instead of having to go through hundreds of problems. It would save a lot of time.
Yeah, and I think that is consistent with our idea of we're going to do less lengthy presentations. So I think that's something that we could look at. Is there information, or is there some sort of summary that we could package together ahead of time?
I'm just thinking in my head, as we were saying that, I'm wondering about this framework. I think what we should get ahead of time should be as comprehensive as possible, right? the memos that we've been getting about what your meetings have been with the ARB and the things that have come back and forth there, you know, the background documentation about what you guys have looked over and analyzed. I think we should try and make that as comprehensive as possible so that, you know, ahead of the meeting, we can read through it and as Genoa said, like, we can highlight things that we have questions on, right? That's ahead of the meeting. Then maybe at the meeting, you present on, hey, what you think are the kind of the highlight take-home things for each task, or if you want to break up the tasks per meeting, but we just say, hey, in this task, you know, in task 1, here's the key highlights that we think came out of that, right? And we can have a discussion about that, right? But then leave, you know, but that should be kind of a somewhat summarized presentation, right? Here's the key findings that we found, and that can include, like, and we ruled this out, and here's why, right? That could be a presentation, and then we have some feedback that we give you on that, and then leave it a little bit more open, like open discussion for someone to bring up, well, hey, I read in the background material about such and such. Can you tell me more about that? So in other words, you have that brief summary presentation on a task, or however we want to organize it, key findings from that task. Do the presentation on it. We have some interaction, discussion about those key findings. And then we have an open section where it's like, hey, where someone will have the opportunity to discuss maybe something that they read in the report that wasn't covered. Does that, and then people feel free to, you know,
I think that
add in.
your idea of the breakdown of tasks makes some sense because the tasks are broken into the structures.
That's how you're organizing it right now,
Yeah,
right?
so it would provide a way to discuss the structure in detail.
Well, to tag on to that, although we got a knowledgeable, diverse group right here, what the fear is that these plans are being formulated and we're being told the decision without having input in the process. We're always a meeting or two behind to provide community input. Right now, you already have your game plan on what you're going to talk about tomorrow with the IRB. All you need to do is redact the sensitive information, provide that to us next week, and we've got 3 to 4 weeks to prep for the following meeting on the meat and potatoes that's going to be discussed with the IRB. A year ago, you said that you were going to hire a consultant to help redact information and communicate general summaries and statements to the IRB, or to the Ad Hoc Group of what is discussed in the IRB meetings, and I don't think that's happened yet because we haven't gotten a lot of meat and potatoes, redacted information. Right now, the Ad Hoc Group doesn't know what we don't know because there's been no communication on those things. And when we do find out, the decision's been made, and we haven't had a chance to go back to our constituents downstream and says, how's this going to affect your business? How's this going to affect your livelihood?
That's where my hope would be. This approach that we're talking about is, you know, some information by task ahead of time, us flagging, you know, here's with our assessment, here's what rose to the top for us. But then that's where that input from you, I think, would be helpful on does that make sense being downstream, what we're saying, here's the biggest things that.
But his point is ahead of time. I think the summary thing should be at the meeting.
Right.
The more like, you know, summarized presentation should be at the meeting, but ahead of time, as much information as possible, right? I mean, maybe you can obviously redact things that are, you know, considered, you know, critical, you know, CEII type stuff. But the more that we know, like, comprehensively what you guys are discussing, then we can better be prepared to discuss at a meeting, right? That's what you're saying.
Yeah, I would like to add something. That's a good comment. Just to assure you, though, Matt, that, you know, what we're presenting is in-progress work. So we don't view it as completed work that we can't go back on. It's work that, you know, is in progress, and your input is going to be taken. So I just want to make sure that's clear.
You've been to enough meetings, so has I, that late input is usually met with some resistance because you already had 12 people shake their head yes on a formulation or measure. we would like to have input before we had 12 head shakes.
You want to help set the plate?
Yes.
Yeah, so we're not there yet at the 12 head shakes, so the next meeting will be, you know, a really good opportunity where we're starting to kind of
So-
show what's coming out.
John, what's the likelihood that we could get really some meat and potatoes out 2 weeks in advance of November 13th, or at least a week in advance, that would allow folks to digest that, and for me to prep the bosses more effectively as to what you're gonna talk about, so that they all can, I mean, I think that's what we're really getting at. And then keep these meetings light on the presentation up front, as Assemblyman Gallagher said, but then really open up the balance of the time for folks to offer comments. I think that's really what we're at.
Yeah, I looked at Sergio and integration folks there on, I mean, that seems like a reasonable approach to do a package of material beforehand. And I think the week to 2 week to give it time to digest would be reasonable. So I guess I'm looking for somebody to tell me that if there's a problem that I'm overlooking there.
Well,
with-
I guess my struggle, you know, on one end, I'm hearing that we want to keep things at a very high level, and then we want all this information. So I'm trying
It's
to.
Well, I think that Sergio, I think the point is send us the info, let us identify what we want to talk about, and then at the meeting, if we needed to, we can get into the minutia. But I think for the most part, this group is going to be more of a high-level approach. But rather than trying to, send us everything, let us review it, but we have to have the time to do so. Having us look at it at the meeting is part of the problem, or not in advance. I think, is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah.
It's high level at the meeting. It's high level at the meeting and in the presentation. Hey, here's the key findings for this task, right? But I think in terms of what we want to see before that meeting, should be as comprehensive as possible, right? Like, hey, here's all the things that we discussed with IRB, and, I mean, as much, because we can read, we'll go through those things and we'll, and decipher, and then there might be things that we come up and go, hey, well, I'm wondering about this, and we can get into more in-depth there, rather than having a really long presentation at the meeting. We can just get right down into the meat at the meetings. Does that make sense?
I think it's worth trying for this next meeting, and we'll see how it works. But I think that seems like a reasonable. Henry? Yeah.
Maybe if I could offer just a little bit of perspective, kind of as an independent person. So for the meeting that's going to take place tomorrow, we've been given almost 250 megabytes of information to sort through and look at. I haven't had a chance to really talk with the other IRB members, but from my perspective, the vast majority of that information is CEII information. And so simply going through and redacting all of that out leaves you with a whole bunch of information that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because it doesn't have the critical pieces of information that help you understand which ones of those potential failure modes are truly important and which ones of the measures are going to be most effective. So you can be careful what you wish for. You could get a large volume of information that you really may not be able to make a lot of sense out of.
That's the recommendation, to hire somebody to redact information, give us summarized statements, so at least we know what you're talking about without the details that could be detrimental to terrorists.
And wasn't that the purpose of hiring an independent review board? Was to be able to look at what they're doing and give you, and give DWR some comments on where they're going and what do they need to be looking at.
Yeah, I think it's really more about what are you guys discussing in that meeting tomorrow? Not about all the stuff that you've reviewed necessarily.
Right.
But the key points of everything that you discuss, because obviously anything that you bring up in that meeting tomorrow is probably going to be something pretty important. right? I mean,
And if it's important, it'll
and
be
we
in
would
our
like to-
report.
Right, and that's where
Yeah.
we want to know, what that is. And I would say, just in addition to that, like, maybe some of the background material that's part of that discussion, right? That, I guess that's what I'm kind of meaning by
Yeah.
as comprehensive as possible.
So I think in the prior meetings, we were trying to take, 8 hours of presentation and condense them. So I think what you're suggesting, James, is we take a look at those packages and see what we're able to share out of it. And so I
Yeah,
think that's what we'll
then we
do.
can review that information. And then on the presentation side, it doesn't have to be as long. You can go, hey, here's the key findings, here's the key things that we came down, here's something that we ruled out that we know is, gonna be something that people care about, right? And why, right? I mean, what you would wanna know. It's kinda like, I think if we can get those key findings out there, then we can have a discussion about just the key findings. We don't have to go through the whole thing, well, hey, right? We just go, here were the key findings and why. Does that make sense?
I think part of the key here is that the group as a whole is getting all this information, the IRB report, at the meeting, right? And then we're being asked to give you valuable feedback at the meeting. And that just doesn't work because none of us have the time to
We don't
really
have time to
digest
review
that.
it.
So I think even if it's the IRB's perspectives in advance of the meeting, that would be a value to having a much more constructive meeting than us looking at this stuff at the here right now, and none of us can formulate that quickly. I think that's really what it comes down to.
That makes sense.
And the other thing that I think is missing is, that was a wonderful presentation, on the instrumentation that you're going to be installing over there. What we didn't hear was the history that caused it, or what evidence has shown up in the past that forced this hand and why, so that, and that's going to play true to every probable failure mode that you put out there, is we're not hearing what provoked this measure to be even looked at. And we're kept in the dark on that too. So and that was even one of the IRB's recommendations early on in meeting two, is why are you looking at this? And those things haven't been communicated to us as much as I think you're capable of doing, almost, and that plays back to the transparency issue. I was really hoping, when you guys put together this meeting, that we would really come out of this with more trust and transparency, develop future partnerships. And I'm still holding that hope that can be achieved over these next 3 meetings before this thing wraps up. So add that into the process too. In the past, we've had, in one of the reports on that, it talked about, the turbidity or the clarity of the water's been running clear since 2011. Well, what was it doing before 2011? We never heard that there was an issue before that. And is that an indication that there's been some seepage? And why has at elevation 800 been sinking at a 2-to-1 factor what the crest has been sinking? We haven't heard those issues, so that we can then intelligently convey back to our constituents that the concerns and the rumbling that they've been hearing are being talked about, and that there's plans coming up for them. Root causes, root evidence to even start these measures needs to be discussed further as well.
Well, Matt, we're committed to what your goal was, being open and transparent. So we're definitely committed to that. We're looking forward to continuing this. And some of those topics may be ones that, like how the dam's performance, we do evaluate that regularly. That might be a topic for a citizen commission meeting, perhaps. We'll talk about it in the context of this process too, but yeah, we're open to sharing that information.
Yeah. There's ways that you can generalize it without, and still protecting CEII, so that when constituents come back to us and ask us, we can say, yeah, they are looking at that, and there's some measures coming forth that is to address that. Because there's people out there that have knowledge of history of performances and stuff, you know, Palermo tunnel thicknesses and everything else are things that come our way, and that you need to give us the whys.
And I think Senator Nielsen and some of Gallagher's point is that part of maybe some of what you really want to talk about, we can address, but we'll do it at the comprehensive, or at the Citizens Advisory Committee meetings, where we have a forum that can really get to your really point, which is communicating to the constituency, the public. And I think what John and Ted are saying is that some of these things, well, they'll be addressed in the CNA, probably can get more in depth and more airtime, so to speak, at some of the future meetings. And by the way, those go on forever. I mean, they don't end with the CNA. Those meetings will continue. So there could be follow-up meetings to the initial discussions. And I think the challenge with the CNA is it's got a deadline. And so there's some things that might be better suited to plant those conversations over in the Citizens Advisory Committee arena rather than here, and they get more in-depth discussion.
Yeah, I wanted to say, I think of the CNA as what long-term infrastructure changes are gonna be made to the entire facility in order to make it more safe. And I think there's 4 things that we hear are concerns that I think should be focused on. One is, should the emergency spillway be fully lined? You know, is that a problem, and is there a potential solution to fully line the emergency spillway? Does there need to be redundancy? We have one spillway right now. Should there be more than one to add redundancy? Is there an issue with the gates? Right, we hear from people that they're concerned about the headwork structure of the gates. There's cracking. You know, is that a problem? Is it not? Do we need to replace them? Do we don't? I think that's what people want to hear. And then is there an issue with where we can release from the main spillway? Remind me, it's 813,
Yeah.
right? Is there an issue where we need to release more water below 813? Do we need a low-level outlet to evacuate more water quickly in advance of a warm storm when we have a ton of snowpack, right? I'd say those are the 4 things that, at least from my perspective, I want to know, like, are there issues? Are there problems? Are we concerned with that? And what are the potential solutions to fix those 4 things?
I would just add maybe a 5th would probably be that the public obviously talks a lot about the dam itself and the green spot, and are there issues there? And the piezometers obviously are part of what you're trying to do to address that, but are there other measures that you're doing to try to address any kind of seepage issues on the dam itself?
One thing that crept in last time around that I didn't make a big deal of it, but I thought about it some afterwards, is the foliage around the spillway and the possibilities of the drains getting plugged, as we've had that happen before. There was something about the aesthetics of the trees around and whatever, but sometimes that's not you don't want those trees around. And that's particularly one of my complaints about the bypass structures in California, that we too much foliage grow up in the bypasses. Those are storage facilities, those are not habitat places. They can have a good value in that, but if you let too much grow up, then they don't serve their purpose, and it puts additional pressure on the levees of the bypasses. We've had lots of trouble with that before. And just for what the heck it's worth, there are a couple other things that go at play right now. I don't know that we're going to much deal with them here, but one, the fires and the management of the forest and the wildlands, the watershed. That's a big darn deal. And a lot of us are paying a lot of attention to that now. That's a far bigger picture. And I'm certainly concerned about that. The siltation, the desnagging that may be required as a product of that. So we're keeping an eye on that. That's in the back of my mind as we proceed with a lot of things. So, do give that some thought, that it's something that does need to pay attention to. And it will regulate the pressures and the dynamics of our rivers. They always have. and they will continue to, but this is something that we need to keep in mind, and it's very much on our minds now as we're dealing with the fires, and that's, by the way, going to be a long, long time deal. We're going to be continued and be very engaged in it.
So I know we got to wrap up. We're getting
Yeah.
close here. They brought up some very fundamental issues that I think everybody anticipates will be part of, what we're going to hear in these next few meetings. Can I get the confirmation from you that those are some of the issues, that those issues are definitely things that are going to be addressed in this discussion in the next?
Yeah, I think we're definitely gonna, I think these, we'll be talking about how for us, some of these are rising to the top. And then I think if anything doesn't rise to the top, I think we'll definitely, that'll be an area that we'll definitely need to discuss why we aren't as concerned. So yes.
And then a commitment to perhaps try to get some of this background to us of your reasonings on these issues that were
Yeah,
identified.
much material as possible
Yeah.
ahead of time. so.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you all very much. November 20th is our next meeting, and look forward to seeing you all there and back in Oroville. So
13th, you're thinking,
it's the other meeting. Yes, thank you. Thank you for, everyone's paying attention.
and
Thank
that will
you.
be back at our original spot.
Correct. Correct. Thank you, Senator.
John, gotta
Appreciate
get
it.
off the other